I'm doing that now. Apologies for that. And so, oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about transportation. So transportation is always a huge slice of the budget. But this particular year is pretty status quo. Bruce Harrell has never really had a huge priority vision for transportation. This year is really not really a big exception to that. The big looming thing happening right now is we're kind of getting to the finish line with the $930 million transportation levy we passed in 2015. And so we're kind of trying to get all these projects on the ground before people get their ballots and decide whether or not they want to renew this. And so there's not a lot of flashy things. The new SDOT director, Greg Spots, has sort of been consistently talking about how there's no money for new projects, although there's been a couple here and there. But yeah, so let's see here. Oh, I see. Okay, just seeing your questions here, making sure we can keep those answered as we're going, or we'll come back to that shot spotter question. And so, but kind of the big controversy about the 2024 budget in SDOT compared to, as Amy mentioned, the endorsed one that had been passed last year, actually is kind of the intersection of SPD and SDOT. And so transportation revenue in Seattle comes from a lot of different places, including that levy I mentioned, but not insubstantial amount of revenue, especially for kind of pedestrian safety projects, comes from the arsenal of school zone speed cameras we have all around the city, which are active 40 minutes before, 40 minutes after school. Some schools have a lot more speeders than others, and this was a story that actually broke at the Urbanist in May. The Seattle Times didn't cover this until the budget came out, but the Seattle Police Department spent almost, I think, over a year basically letting school zone tickets expire. So drivers were speeding. We fully had their license plates, but we weren't sending tickets out within 2 weeks as required. And so that's kind of the worst of both worlds because it's not really doing anything. So, and the revenue is kind of causing a huge gap. And so originally they had proposed cutting some sort of full-on safe routes to school projects, new pedestrian path up at a new school near Northgate. But when we got the mayor's budget, they kind of shifted that around. They're like, we're going to kind of try and make sure it doesn't impact one area of the city. So we're going to actually make that cut primarily to the ADA curb ramp program. And so that's been a almost $3 million cut. Almost all of that was, I think, $2.5 million in ADA curb ramps, and then some other things that they were kind of trying to backfill, including the neighborhood greenway program. But they were trying to backfill that neighborhood greenway program with the Vision Zero funding. So it's kind of a little bit of robbing Peter to pay Paul. In the context of this, we do see the mayor's priorities. We have $1 million to activate downtown streetscapes with Jumpstart funding, which was originally intended to go for affordable housing, as you will recall. And so now it's going to kind of aesthetic improvements downtown. Interesting, kind of in the same vein as the new pickleball courts that are at Denny and Fifth Avenue. I think it's a cool use of space. I think the issue of whether that's a good use of Jumpstart funding is a totally different question. But that's kind of how we can see the mayor's priorities in transportation. Sort of this little sprinkling, but no real vision. Mostly just continuing the Move Seattle. Next spring we're going to see what the mayor actually proposes to do with the next Move Seattle, which is going to be a much different question in terms of we kind of have to have a vision if you're going to present that. It's not clear what that looks like, and we're not going to get too much into that since we're talking about this year's budget. But I want to go back to Amy to kind of talk a little bit about the cliff that's coming.
Oh yeah, I can talk about the cliff. Okay, I'm laughing, but it's actually it's like a laughing or else I'll cry kind of situation. To be clear, it's not actually funny. It's kind of horrifying. So we are staring at a huge deficit coming up next year. My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan, is that now that deficit stands at $251 million. It was lower than that. It was like 220 something million. But with the mayor's new proposed budget for 2024, it's kicked it up a bit. So now it's at
Yeah.
251.
So like, yeah, I'll say like, the mayor, we had kind of been dealing with a mayor who was kind of ignoring this cliff. I think right now he's kind of adding a ramp. I think is the metaphor I would use. Like they're actually kind of digging the hole a little bit deeper right now.
Yeah, I would agree with that characterization. So, okay, why does this matter? It matters because next year when we go into budget season, if we don't do anything now, we'll be looking at $251 million that we need to cut, which is, I think, the definition of an austerity budget at that point. And it means that there is a intense need for new progressive revenue for the city. And we can't wait until next budget season to like look at that because new progressive revenue it needs some time, right? Like you need a ramp up to get it going and make sure it's working and set it up right and figure out how you're going to collect it, figure out how much exactly you think you're going to get. All there's a lot of details. It's not the most simple thing ever. So we really need to pass new progressive revenue this year before the end of the year in order to prepare for a budget season next year. And I mean, also because even though we only are really dealing with budget season starting at the end of September, departments are being asked to look at their budgets much, much earlier. So again, if they don't know if there's going to be any new progressive revenue, then how are they going to plan what they're going to do in the next year? I mean, they can't, right? Or they have to just assume for the worst. Um, so, with that in mind, the budget chair, Councilmember Mosqueda, is very interested in passing new progressive revenue. And there's actually going to be some extra discussions about it in the budget this year, which is great. And I can give you dates maybe a little bit later in, but I did just want to talk about like different proposals that I've been hearing about so that you have a basic familiarity of what they are as we talk about this more in the next month or so. So one of the proposals on the table, and this was originally proposed by Councilmember Peterson. Yes, you did hear me correctly. He's proposing a capital gains tax on the city level. So, it would be similar to the one that we have at the state level, but lower, right? Like 1%, maybe 2%. And Councilmember Peterson is proposing that this tax be passed and that a water fee be taken away. So it would actually be revenue neutral if we do what Councilmember Peterson wants. It wouldn't actually help us with this big gap we have coming up. I am unclear myself as to how regressive a tax this water fee actually is because I know that there are some like rebates and payment assistant programs. So I'm going to be really interested to hear what council's central staff has to say in their analysis of this water tax and how aggressive is it. And do we want to just have the capital gains tax and not take away the water tax, or would it be a good idea to take away that water tax even though it would make it revenue neutral? So that's one of the issues that I think I'm pretty confident that we're going to have a conversation about that in November. Another issue that I know we're going to be talking about is Jumpstart. So the Jumpstart payroll tax. And I know this because Councilmember Sawant has already proposed some stuff having to do with this. And what she's asking this year, she's taken a more subtle approach than she's taken in past years, which I think is pretty interesting. Um, and she's asking for a very small increase in how much the jumpstart tax would ultimately take in. I think it's 60 million total, 20 million for schools, for school counselors, and mental health counselors for schools and that kind of thing. And then 40 million for the pay raises for city workers. Like most of our city workers are currently in contract negotiations for their, for their pay. And she wants to put aside this extra money so that it's clear that that money is available and that they should be given like an actual substantial non-insulting cost of living raise increase. So that would be 60 million altogether that she's proposing, would just raise Jumpstart a little bit. And it is actually, I wrote this down, y'all might be interested. It would be to generate 50 million. So she's asking for 60. So it would be a little bit higher than this, but this is the numbers I've got. It would be a 0.1% to 0.4% increase applied proportionately across the Jumpstart tiers. So 0.1 to 0.4, very tiny increase, right? That would make 50 million. So, bump that up a tiny bit. I don't know exactly how much. And that's what we're looking at. And then the other one that might be on the table, and this one I am less sure about, but I've been hearing through the grapevine, it might show up. So to prepare you, is a CEO pay ratio tax, which is really interesting. So what this would do is it would use Jumpstart, that tax, as a vehicle, and it would add another layer of tax on top of that tax. And basically it would be for corporations that pay their top executives a whole lot of money. And it would be an extra tax on that. And I do not know yet how much this would bring in. All I've heard is that it would be significant. So that's another thing that, if this conversation progresses, I'm hoping that maybe central staff can give us an actual figure that, or range. I'm sure it would be a range that is not just significant, but like give us an idea of how much revenue something like that would actually bring in. So those are the three. The first two we're 100% going to see. The one I just talked about, think we might see, but I haven't actually for sure confirmed that.
And so, Amy, I think we're seeing some modest proposals that actually have some traction right now, with Councilmember Mosqueda, Councilmember Herbold actually signing on to some of these proposals to increase the jumpstart tax, which last year was a non-starter, had been a non-starter for a while.
I was
Mhm.
so surprised. Like
And
I
so,
literally said,
mhm,
I bet they're not gonna, there's no way they're doing it. And then they did.
mhm,
So
yeah. Um, And so I think there's a possibility right now. We can be hopeful that there's going to be some of that gap is going to fill, but the idea of filling the entire gap is kind of um, it's kind of hard to envision that right now. But my question for you, as someone who follows this, we're hearing a lot about this budget gap on the campaign trail, and the go-to response, even from some of the progressive candidates who might support some of these tax proposals, is they want to do a full audit. They want to look at all the departments. They want to get under the hood. They want to sort of understand. And as someone who is trying to figure out as much about the budget, how likely is it that they're going to be able to do that in their first 9 months in the job before they head into their first budget season? Is that realistic?
in my opinion, I mean, no, I always kind of laugh a little when they say that. Like I understand why they're saying that from a political perspective, but I mean first of all, it's very complicated, right? Like all
Mhm.
of these budgets are like, they do take time to understand. It's not that I don't think that there's any redundancy there. I'm sure there is, but like figuring it out and then figuring out how to fix it, like I feel like might
Mhm.
not be as straightforward as they might think. Also, the auditor, my understanding is our auditor is underfunded right now. They're actually
Mhm.
trying to give the auditor a little more
Mhm.
funding in one of the amendments,
Yeah.
because they don't have enough money. So who's gonna do this if the auditor doesn't have enough money to do
Mhm.
their normal job as it is? I mean, and they audit every. I mean, they already have a very important and big job. Like to put this on top of it, I don't know.
Yeah. And the auditors tapped out. They already have a pretty full workload, kind of figuring out these very important problem streams that they're already dealing with. One example I could point to is, Councilmember Peterson, as Transportation Committee Chair, has been trying to get a spend plan for the Seattle Transit measure that we passed in 2020 for next year, and has been trying to do that for about 6 months. And that's one revenue stream that he's trying to get a spend plan from. And even after he got that spend plan, it was not clear what he would do with that information. It included some vague line items that he can cite, but it's not clear how to modify, what the impacts of that would be. You could cut it, I guess, if you wanted to do that, take a blunt instrument. That's unlikely to happen, especially if the mayor doesn't propose it. And so I think that they're not being quite realistic about what's going to happen. To your point about the long ramp up time for revenue proposals. So, as an example, last year in the budget, the city council passed a $10 increase to the city's vehicle license fee, the car tab, going from $40 to $50. Created specific programs for that to fund, and basically said, okay, it's going to go all to this thing in the first year, and then after that, it will get split because it takes a while to set up a vehicle license fee. Um, September comes around of this year, and the city, what office was it? City budget office is like, hey, nobody told the state that we need to start collecting that extra $10. And so it's not going to even be collected until January 1. And so that's one example of the fact that we're on our back foot right now in terms of this budget deficit. And it's not clear what's going to happen. But the idea of passing a full-on progressive revenue next fall that's going to be able to totally fill that gap, it's not realistic. And B, the idea of auditing every department to figure out where the fat is also not realistic. So unfortunately, we're going to have to rely on, it's ultimately going to be the mayor who decides what happens. And the mayor is basically pretending like this doesn't exist. Like I said, adding ongoing costs in 2024 that will continue into 2025. And so it's just a little bit of uh, I don't know. I don't know what to say about it. It's
I mean, I have my theories about what would happen if we don't pass any new progressive revenue or insufficient new revenue. Like, I mean, I could be wrong. I mean, this honestly, this is just me thinking about what I know, right? Like, but I think that they'll just take the jumpstart tax and use it as a slush fund, which they've been trying to do anyway, and they'll just pull it into general fund, which is the money that doesn't have a spend plan. It's unrestricted, right? You can use the city council can use the general fund for whatever they want. A lot of the rest of the money um, can only be used for particular purposes, right? So they'll take Jumpstart, which is not supposed to. It has a spend plan that was passed legislatively, and I think they'll probably change that legislation, move over all the Jumpstart dollars just to fill in the huge deficit. And to be clear, I mean, what we're talking about here, the Jumpstart plan, it mostly goes to housing, right? Affordable housing. It's 62% affordable housing, 9% Green New Deal, 9% equitable development initiative, and then 15% for small businesses. So housing, we're in a housing crisis, and that's where the money's potentially going to come from.
And that's why it's particularly, I don't know what the word is, interesting to see $1 million spent on, benches downtown for jumpstart funding when we are kind of facing this huge thing, looming crisis ultimately, that there's going to be very few people who are equipped to MHA development fees. Someone's asking about that as a revenue source. All I can say is that we're not building housing. So housing permits are way down. It's like 75% compared to 2 years ago. So it's that is not really gonna hold through. I wasn't going to get into this too much, but there's another proposal to generate transportation impact fees, which is just like taxing housing to pay for transportation. So I mean, it's kind of like contradictory in terms of self-defeating, I would say. And so is there existing money from that to build new affordable housing? Sure. I mean, that's basically what is happening right now. The housing that's being built right now is the MHA fees from 2 years ago or whatever. There are very few that are coming in right now. So there's some, and we're going to hopefully pass the housing levy this next week, and that'll include more property taxes. So that's a stable revenue source, but ultimately it's we have to do more. And so we got into that a little bit earlier than I expected. I kind of expected us to kind of end on that, but that's fine. Let's go ahead. I do want to do a little bit of talking about the amendment proposals that are on the table before we get into Q&A, sort of the areas where we can actually see the priorities each council member has. We're not going to do everyone. There's so many of them. I think they went through 50 or 60 on Friday, but kind of the big ones. Going to go over to Amy to talk a little bit about what she's seeing in the amendments.
Yeah, there are a lot of them. Interestingly, most of the ones that I think are interesting and are related to public safety, they aren't actually in SPD. So to be clear, it's not all about SPD. I will start with the ShotSpotter amendment because I want to answer the question also that was in the chat. So the mayor's argument for why ShotSpotter this year, again, the second year in a row, is that this year they're proposing to pair it with the CCTV cameras, which was not part of the proposal last year. And Tim Burgess, when he was presenting about this, said that this made them have greater accuracy and greater ability to be admissible in court, because one of the other problems with ShotSpotter is that most ShotSpotter evidence gets thrown out because it's just there's no scientific basis for it, and of course just throw it out because it's no good. So anyways, he said with the CCTV that this is different, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Is it different? I need to know. So I looked around and I asked many other people to look around to answer that specific question. And we did find one study, and I can link it in the chat when I'm done talking, that shows that no, adding CCTV does not make it more effective or more accurate. Also, several cities that have ShotSpotter already, they also have CCTV, and one of them in particular being Chicago. There are several. Chicago is just one example, but Chicago has been one of the cities where their OIG made this big report of like all the problems with ShotSpotter. So a lot of data from Chicago in particular about how problematic ShotSpotter is, and that is already paired with CCTV. Councilmember Herbold asked Tim Burgess to send her studies in support of this claim, And she said on Friday that the studies that she finally received a month later, I think all but one were just about CCTV and had nothing to do with ShotSpotter. So 100% not what she asked for. And then the last one was like some kind of like manual, like suggesting that maybe you could use ShotSpotter in concurrence with CCTV, and maybe that would be a good idea. So not again, not a study. Um, so he said there were studies. Councilmember Harrell asked those studies to be sent to her, and none of them were, which I mean, I don't even know what to say about that. The lack of rigor, the lack of transparency, it is something. It's noteworthy. That's what it is. So segueing from that to amendments, there is an amendment that would take 1.5 million from that crime prevention pilot. So that would leave the license plate readers, but it would take away the ShotSpotter plus CCTV cameras. And this is a SAWANT amendment. It's an HSD amendment. I have a list of all the interesting ones here, so let me make sure I get the details right. Yes, it would go to behavioral health services at tiny house villages, because there was 2.5 million one-time funding for that in 2023, but there's only 500,000 of that in the chair's balancing package. And what these behavioral health services allow you to do at the tiny home villages is it allows people who have greater needs to live there. So it means people who have more serious mental health issues can still be housed at the tiny house villages. And if these behavioral health services are defunded, if they're no longer available, then that would be less possible. And of course, you know, we want everyone to be housed, right? We want to get everyone off the street. So that means we need to provide these wraparound services for the people that need more than just the place to live. So that is what she is proposing that money be used for. There is another amendment from Lewis that would also fund that, but only part of that amount. And it's taking money from the Rosie's tiny house village. It needs to be moved because I think they're building a transportation project there. So it has to be moved. That's very expensive. So they've put aside money to move this village next year. And basically Lewis was like, well, maybe we won't need it until 2025 to be moved. So let's use this money for a few things, including these behavioral health services, and hope for the best. And if not, we can use some emergency fund money, but hopefully we just won't need it till next year. And I'm like, but next year we have a 250 million. Anyway, that's the other potential source of funding, which obviously has issues. So that is our main kind of, I think, hope at this point for removing the ShotSpotter piece from the budget. So that's an amendment I'm going to be watching. That's a HSD 4A. There's a few amendments that would add a little bit of money to domestic violence services, which I was really happy to see. There also is a SLI, so that's a statement of legislative intent. Often it's either signaling a council's intent or it's asking for a report, or both. So this is a SLI, but I am happy to see this SLI because it is an analysis of the city's investments in gun violence prevention programs. And I've been asking for this, I've been personally asking for this for a while. And HSD has been working on it, but now they're going to be moving maybe some things to the care department. So it's a little bit messy. So there's a slide to make sure that these two departments work together to try to develop this analysis for where the gaps are in the gun violence prevention programs. Like, they also are like things that are duplicative. And I can tell you, because I did an article on this for the Urbanist a few months ago, that there is so little money invested in this area that I would be shocked if anything was really duplicative, because we really just need a lot more money in that area. But just to like figure out where the gaps are, what best practice would be, like what in an ideal world, how much money would we be putting, and do we need more programs? Which programs should we be scaling up? All that kind of stuff, which would be great to know. We don't really know. So this slide would be asking them to have a report to answer some of those questions, which I see no reason why that wouldn't go through. Council members Mosqueda and Nelson are fighting over $300,000 for substance abuse disorder treatment and how that's going to be done. I'm sure that it will be done. I'm sure $300,000 will be devoted to that purpose one way or another, but I don't know whose plan is going to win out. There's also an interesting proviso. This is the only SPD item I have, that SPD start a new contract with Trulio. So Trulio is a technology that police departments can buy, and it uses AI and other stuff to analyze body cam footage and audio. And what's interesting to me about Trulio is that SPD requested money for Trulio for the 2022 budget year. And council actually specifically told them no. There's a bunch of money for tech, right? Like they want to do, like, I don't know, 6 or 7 projects. And council said, we'll fund XYZ project, but we won't fund Trulio. Don't do Trulio. SPD turned around, does Trulio anyway. Then SPOG, which is the union for the rank and file police officers, gets upset about Trulio. And what I just found out yesterday, I didn't realize this. I think it's related to the Janavi Kandula case, and the footage that was found of the SPOG vice president saying really upsetting, insulting things about the victim of the police car ran her over, basically. Apparently that might have had something to do with Trulio, and might have been why SPD suddenly stopped. They yanked the contract this year. So now council is like, actually, we want you to spend the money to do Trulio. So we'll see what happens with that. Like, I am not, to be clear, I think there are other problems with Trulio. I just think it's kind of ironic that SPD asked for it and then didn't want it, and now council is trying to get it back in. Like, it's very silly, but there are civil rights and privacy concerns around the use of Trulio, and so the fact that this is ironic shouldn't make us not take a look at that aspect as well. ACLU of Washington is against the use of Trulio, so just to give that perspective. Other than that, I mean, there are, they're trying to give slightly more pay increases to HSD workers. I mean, and talking about public safety workers who are underpaid, that's these folks. So hopefully those amendments will go through and they'll be slightly less underpaid as a result. They're trying to get OPA, the Office of Police Accountability. It's one of Seattle's 3 police accountability bodies, to have an independent budget outside of SPD's budget. I don't really, they're saying it will make it more independent. I am a little skeptical as to how much more independent this will actually make them in practice. I think, the fact that they are forced to have cops investigating cops is probably a much bigger issue than where their budget is housed. But that being said, that's another thing on the table right now.
I'm going to run through a little bit of the transportation amendments, but I'll just do that really quick. So, the bright spot in terms of the city's revenue is sales tax right now, with more purchases happening, and so that means there's more money for the in the transit measure that we passed in 2020, that's sales tax. So Council members are kind of eyeing that as their honeypot right now. In addition to the fact that there's always been a little bit of extra money in that source because we were having trouble hiring bus drivers at Metro, which is the primary thing that goes to fund. And so we have a kind of a competing amendments. Councilmember Dan Strauss is proposing to use 1 million of that to hire transit ambassadors for King County Metro. It's not clear that Strauss knows what transit ambassadors do. So Metro has a very small pilot of transit ambassadors that basically stand at bus stops and help people. They're currently Metro operators who are not driving buses for whatever reason. And, Strauss has consistently mentioned sort of people on a bus who will take care of a bottle rolling around in the back of a bus. It's a very strange instance that I guess he has personally experienced before. It's not a huge problem to me as someone who rides the bus every day, but it might be to Dan. But that sounds like a kind of a security issue. I'm not even sure. That's a maintenance. It's not clear. But Metro just did a bunch of security hiring. They spent 20 million for this biennium on security, not counting that transit ambassador program. So it's not clear if that's what that's going to do. The thing about it is it's kind of an ongoing expense. So if we decide we're going to do $1 million and hire people, then we are going to want to hire them into 2025. And so that's another ongoing expense to a measure that's already funding bus service, transit passes for low-income people, capital projects to kind of improve transit experience. And so it's another kind of pot that we're adding in because of a bottle rolling around the back of a bus. So another idea for that revenue stream is an interesting collaboration between Councilmember Morales and Councilmember Alex Peterson. We don't always agree on a lot, but I mentioned earlier that Peterson's been trying to get an idea of that spend plan for the transit measure. And so after he's been kind of insufficiently satisfied by the answers he's been getting, he's proposing that they divert 1.4 million out of that, most of which would go to restarting the accessible Mount Baker project, which is this vision that was created a decade ago to kind of remake the streets around Mount Baker Station. Those two of the most dangerous streets in the city intersect there. There's a high school, there's a light rail station, there's a transit center. So kind of get that restarted, and then use the remainder of the 400K to do things like speed up the Route 8, which is a thing that advocates have been asking for. It's not clear that the actual Route 8 is going to get improvements, but things like that to be able to get buses out of traffic. So there's kind of competing amendments. And yeah, those are kind of the top line big changes that are kind of being proposed. I'm going to say I kind of want to go back to Amy and kind of talk about, what she's seen kind of be successful when you're kind of advocating amendments, sort of, the question I think that I kind of wanted to answer in this workshop, because it's a lot of information, we're trying to make things a little bit more actionable. So you see an amendment, what do you do? Like, what do you, we're not talking about proposing an amendment, which might be a different topic. That deadline's already passed this year, but it might be worthwhile talking about that. But like, you see this whole list, like, oh, I would like to do that. What do you do? What happens?
Yeah, so I mean, you have options depending on what your schedule is and what your strengths are or your comfort level is. But I mean, at this point, all of these amendments are going to be voted on by the council members. So I'd say your best bet is to talk to the council members, and there are a lot of ways you can do this. So I'll just run through them. You can email your council members. That's probably the quickest. You can call their offices. You won't talk to them probably, but you'll talk to a staff member, and you can say which amendment you would like to support or oppose. Either way. You can set up a meeting with your council member. I will say they're going to be super busy right now, at the tail end of budget season. So that might be tricky, but you can try. I mean, there's no harm in trying, and sometimes, you can slide in. So that's an option. And then the last option is that you can give public comment. So you can actually go to one of these budget meetings, either in person at City Hall, or you can call in remotely if you don't want to go into City Hall. And you will get a certain amount of time to give public comment. I mostly it's been 90 seconds this year so far. It's usually somewhere between 60 seconds and 2 minutes. But 90 seconds, I'd say, plan for that and then know that it might end up being a little shorter. And I can give you the dates. We have a few more opportunities left for that. The main one is on Monday, November 13th. So it's 2 weeks from today. And they actually weirdly have two public comments for that day. They have one in the morning at 10 a.m. But the one I would suggest that you do is the one in the evening at 5 p.m. And that 5 p.m. is just public comment. So it's a public hearing, and they're not going to be talking about anything else. It's just anyone who wants to can come in and tell council members which amendments they support, which amendments they oppose. You can tell them why. You can give them personal reasons how this will affect your life or the lives of people you know. You can give stats. You can quote papers, research. Whatever you want to include in there to make a very short 90-second persuasive argument for or against an amendment, or you can do several as well. So that would be the main opportunity. And then they are doing something different this year, which is they are going to be talking about legislation that doesn't impact the balancing of 2024. So that's legislation that will affect how the budget is dealt with in general and the progressive revenue that we talked about earlier. That's what that is. So that is going to be talked about on the 15th, but no public comment that day, unfortunately. But they added an extra budget meeting that's going to be on November 30th. I assume at 10 a.m., although I haven't. I assume 10 a.m. unless you hear otherwise, it'll be 10 a.m. I don't know that there will be public comment before that meeting, but there should be. And I definitely will be pushing. And I mean, one of the things you can do is email your council members and encourage them to make sure that there is public comment on that day, because I do think that the public really need the opportunity to weigh in on this progressive revenue, and also the way that budget season is dealt with in the future. I think that's critical. So that extra meeting, that's after Thanksgiving. So the budget will have been passed by then. It's supposed to be passed on the 21st, theoretically, but that progressive revenue, it's going to take a little longer. So that will be on the 30th, and then the full council would vote on that the next week on Tuesday, December 5th. Yes, December 5th. And that's at 2 p.m. That's in the afternoon. It's a full council meeting. There will definitely be public comment at that meeting. But any progressive revenue proposals would need to be passed out of committee first. So it would have to win that vote on the 30th in order to be heard on the 5th, if that makes sense.
And so I do want to get to your questions. Thanks so much for being here and talking through this with us. I do want to provide a couple of tools, though, for you to be able to explore the budget on your own. I'm going to drop them into the chat. So the first link I'm going to drop is sort of the thousands of pages that include the mayor's budget. So basically, if you want to dig into each department, you can do that. It's here. Lots of PDFs, sort of get a full handle. But the second link is probably a little bit more user friendly. That's what sort of the council side. So after the mayor's handed it off the council, they have this great budget dashboard. And so, and there's a really cool amendment amendment section. I don't think it's quite up yet because the amendments were kind of all discussed on Friday, but they always have this great amendments. So you can kind of see who proposed what, and what it is. And so those are like some really cool little links to kind of be able to prepare yourself for what's happening right now during this onslaught of information. Yeah, so Amy, do you have anything else to add before we go into questions?
No, I'm just gonna put that paper about ShotSpotter and CCTV I mentioned in the chat right now, in case anyone wants to.
Cool. Yeah, I'm really excited to answer your questions. We'll do our best. We're obviously trying to get a handle on the budget just as you are. So if we don't have the answers right away, we'll kind of get those to you. But yeah, anyone wanna you can raise your hand, or if that's not working for you, you can just jump in here. I'm sure that'll be fine. Um, while you're thinking of your questions, I'm gonna ask Amy a question to get things started here, which is sort of well, yeah, I wish I had a full question for Amy, but I know that you do somewhere. I guess the question I would ask Amy is sort of, how have you seen budget advocacy that's been successful in the past? Sort of, what have you seen headway being able to make? In my perspective, sort of like the biggest, like being able to reverse cuts that are proposed by the mayor is obviously a big thing that happens by the council. Sort of getting back to that level is frequently a very an easier ask than sort of adding new programs. So like, being able to say, hey, we don't want to cut our curb ramps, like that's a pretty easier ask than say, hey, can we have a new bike lane? So but I'm curious what you think about that.
I would agree with that, especially this year since it's technically the middle of the biennium. So technically, budgets can be done on a 2-year cycle, and we haven't really been doing that in Seattle lately because of the pandemic. And also, I'm not clear that we ever did that as rigorously as say King County does it that way. Um, but I know that this year there has been a push not to add new programming in particular. So it definitely this year that was a much heavier lift than to get cuts restored, that kind of thing. If you want something small, obviously it's easier to find a couple $100,000 than it is to find $20 million, right? Like that's just the way it goes. Um, I mean, the thing I've seen that was most effective at budget advocacy was in 2020 when everyone was marching in the streets every day for months, right? And that of course had the biggest impact, but that's something that you can't do alone. That's something that you have to organize with a whole lot of people in order to move in that kind of a way. But it was very effective, I will say. Like like the mayor vetoed the budget. That's how upset she was by what was finally passed. And then council overrode her veto. It was, I mean, I cried. It was a big moment.
I'll do that once. I have a question for you in the chat, Amy. I'm not quite understanding it, but maybe you will. Would you see giving SPD preemption for safer and faster response a solution to staffing and public safety?
So I don't know what preemption for a safer and faster response means exactly. If you want to take yourself off mute and kind of expand a little, I can maybe answer better.
Yeah. So preemption would be being able to turn traffic signals green instead of waiting or blowing through red lights. So technology that allows them through GPS and radio communication to turn a traffic signal their direction green and everywhere else red to avoid them just speeding through a red light and hoping everyone else is stopping or that pedestrians are clear of the intersection.
Right. Okay. So I don't really know a ton about that technology, I will say. So I take whatever I say right now with a grain of salt, because I would want to research it a lot more thoroughly before saying anything very definitive. I will say that even if that technology was used, the staffing is at such low levels that I don't think that that would be the thing that would, that, you know, I don't know that that would move the needle that much, I guess is what I would say. Um, I I think I think that having more alternative response is probably gonna get you further in that regard. But I would have to look more into that tech.
As someone from the transportation side, it's interesting how often these two topics are kind of interlinked. As someone who works in transportation, I'll say that so many of our traffic signals in the city are decades old, and they're being upgraded on a corridor level, on intersection level, and so I don't see that as really being a systemic solution. We're kind of pulling teeth right now to get that for buses that move in one direction at a single, all day long. And so the idea of kind of being able to create a greenway for police response is, it would just be a very monumental expenditure, in order to create a benefit that's not really very clear, that would be, sustainable, especially since you have, I'll just point out that obviously, the officer responding to Janavi Kandula, in January was going to a suspected overdose, and so it's not clear that they would have been needed at that response in the first place. And so, yeah,
Well, and it wasn't even an
yeah,
opioid overdose, right? It was
yeah.
it was heroin, I think. I'm not positive, but
Mhm.
um yeah, yeah. I mean, I think there's if you what is important to you is faster response times. I don't think that would be the answer. I will say I don't think I think ShotSpotter would actually end up giving you slower response times. I could be wrong
Mhm.
about that, but that's what I suspect. Um, so um, so yeah,
Well, and
it's
I'll just say, like, if you look at the of call responses that SPD responds to, it's like 1 out of 4 is a traffic collision. And so Vision Zero is a response time program in a way. I will say that, like, reducing particularly serious injury collisions that take hours to clear. That is going to reduce response times because you're not scrambling. I was just listening to the Kent Bicycle Advisory Committee before I jumped on this meeting, and basically they have all of their traffic enforcement officers are spending their entire day responding to crashes, and so yeah, it's like a little bit of a kind of a um, we kind of need to think about this a little holistically. Got some more questions. So, Amy, best way to advocate for changes to SBD's budget?
I mean, I think you do all the things I just said. You email, you call, you go and give public comment. And I feel like you go in knowing that you're going in for the longer term, right? Like a lot of these changes we whittle away. Like we've slowly been abrogating these ghost cop positions, but it's a long-term project. But I think it is helpful for council members to hear that people are interested in that. And I also think it's helpful, if you haven't advocated that for that before, it's helpful for them to know that there's a variety of people who would like to see that. So I think, buckle in and know that you're gonna have to be patient. And it also kind of depends what happens with the elections in November, right? Realistically. So
A question about the uncollected car tab money. Um, is there no real oversight into incoming revenue sources? And even if that's the case, how long does it go along for so long without being noticed? Well, it was a couple of months. It should have been obviously caught sooner. Um, it's a question of, is there no real oversight? The answer is no, there's not. We don't have a department of everything. The mayor's office is kind of the catch-all, I guess, in terms of like figuring, like kind of playing referee among the departments. The auditor, as we already mentioned, is pretty overstaffed and kind of focuses on one thing at a time. As Amy mentioned, there's kind of a push to get them some more resources so they can kind of get that money back in terms of, efficiencies and boneheaded things like that.
But that's an amendment,
yeah.
so we don't know if it will pass or not. And I think that's a slightly problem. Like, that's a complicated amendment, I will say. So,
Mhm.
so because it's
It is.
complicated, that means that it's who knows if it will pass or not. I don't know if
Yeah.
you remember, but there are all those parking tickets that got
Mhm.
people didn't end up having to pay them because there was a snafu with PEOs moving from SPD to SDOT, and they didn't do it right. Basically, they skipped a step or something, and so there was, I think, a few $1 million. I don't remember how much it was, but it was a significant amount of money that got lost in traffic tickets a couple years ago, I think last year.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, and that wasn't caught until a reporter mentioned it. So that comes back to what we do here at the Urbanist. And so I do kind of want to wrap up around 8:30 here. I do have one more question on the Center City Connector. So the streetcar, what's happening with that? So it's been on hold. It's been on hold. It's been on hold. So the mayor ostensibly supports the streetcar, which is now called the Cultural Connector, and the First Avenue streetcar. And so, he had proposed some money during the mid-year budget update, which happened only like a couple weeks ago, really, like August. And a couple of council members didn't like that. They pulled it out. He didn't propose a similar amount for the 2024 budget, interestingly enough, even though it's plenty of room. Got $1 million for benches. And so, but it's very interesting to me that during the entire presentation on the SDOT budget a couple of weeks ago, sort of laying out the issues, nobody mentioned the fact that if we didn't do anything, we're going to lose $7.3 million in grants that were already awarded to the city. Like, it's right there. We already got it. It's sitting, waiting for us to move forward on the streetcar. We can have a policy decision about that, but like, it wasn't even mentioned until work that I was able to do by watching an obscure meeting of the Puget Sound Regional Council, getting an update on that grant. And so, Andrew Lewis had said he was supportive of retaining those monies, but I haven't been able to hear back in terms of why he didn't propose an amendment. You had to have 2 co-sponsors for moving forward, but it wasn't even put forward. So it looks like even if the next city council wants to move that streetcar project forward, they're gonna have to go back out and try and get more grants. And since the whole thing is, how much this is going to cost, it's looking more and more like the streetcar is kind of fully dead at this point, unfortunately. On that note, I'm gonna go back to Amy for any final thoughts.
yeah, final thoughts. Let's see if we can be a little more uplifting at the end here. I mean, I feel like this is a cliche at this point, or at least it is to me, because I do so much work around budget, but you will hear people say the budget is a moral document. And I actually firmly believe that. I take it very seriously. I think what we choose to spend our money on as a city or a county or a state shows, what our values are and what we care about. So, I always encourage everyone to get involved with the local budget processes, knowing, that we have sometimes we win what we want, sometimes we don't, but even when we don't win, it's really important just to show up and be part of the civic process. Um, and kind of build over time as well. So that's what I would say. I was really happy to see how many people were interested in coming to this workshop and talking budget with us.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much for coming. It's really cool to be able to walk through this. Like I said, Amy and I spend hours. I tuned into the budget meeting on Friday. It started at
So
10, and SDOT didn't get brought up until 4 o'clock. So and that was just, but last year we were burning the midnight oil. I don't know if we're going to do that again this year. We'll see. That's always fun, honestly. And it sounds sarcastic, but I think we actually mean it when we say that it's fun. So because it's so important to make sure these things get noticed and don't just, if Seattle Channel goes unwatched, then that's the democracy dies in darkness situation. So that's what we're here to prevent. And the fact that over 20 people on this call tonight means that that you care as well. So I really appreciate it. And thanks so much for spending your Monday with us.